welcome to week 2 of our course in constitutional law. In this video, I'd like to talk about representative government, which together with the idea of responsible government is actually one of the key hallmarks of Australian constitutional law. In the next videos, I will talk about responsible government. So going back to the issue of representative government, why is it important? Many would argue that the idea of representative government is important because it underscores the fact that a government actually represents the people. And the reason why government is able to exercise certain powers and the power to govern is because it carries the mandate of the people. And we will try to examine this in greater detail in a short while when we try to distinguish between representative democracy in a presidential form of government versus representative democracy or representative government in a parliamentary system of government. Now, we might say that as far as the mandate to govern is concerned, a government's power to govern directly emanates from a constitution, and that is obviously the case in relation to the Australian government. And when I speak of the Australian government here, I'm referring to the executive branch of government. Again, a notion which is quite problematic and which is a notion we will try to look deeper into in this particular video. The idea that the mandate of government ultimately arises from an electorate exercising their right of suffrage. In fact, if you look closely at democracy, and if you look at the beginnings of the nation states, the beginnings of democracy, especially in ancient Greece, what is called the Hellenic world. Democracy in action then in ancient Greece, or what is known as the Hellenic world, was actually direct democracy, or it was direct democracy by the people. Democracy, for example, if you go by its root word, would have demos and kratos as the root words, and demos refers to people and kratos refers to rule. So the democracy actually means rule of the people. And in ancient Greece, given the fact that it was a small nation state, it was actually possible for people to rule by themselves. But obviously, in a nation state where you have millions of people, the idea of direct democracy seems quite ridiculous. So, as a consequence, we are left with an alternative, not necessarily poorer, but an alternative nonetheless of what is known as representative democracy. And in a representative democracy, the legislative and executive powers are essentially exercised by elected representatives. Now, in a presidential system of government, the president is directly elected by the people. And this happens especially in the United States. Although, at the end of the day, it's actually the Electoral College in the United States which elects the US president. And as has happened in the case in the elections between George W. Bush and Al Gore actually won the popular vote, and yet it was George W. Bush who won the US presidency, mainly because it is the Electoral College in the end which chooses the US president on the basis of votes that are assigned to each state, who are then represented by members of a state to the Electoral College. Now, in a parliamentary system of government, on the other hand, the Prime Minister is not directly chosen by the people. Instead, he is chosen by members of Parliament. And that raises the question of to whom the Prime Minister is ultimately responsible. In a presidential system of government, if it is the people who directly vote for the president, then ultimately the president must be accountable to the people. But in a parliamentary system of government, because it is Parliament which chooses the Prime Minister, then it raises the notion that ultimately accountability of the Prime Minister rests with Parliament. And we will see this in action when we look at the idea of responsible government. Now, what are the implications of what we have just talked about in terms of representative government? In a presidential system of government, it essentially means that the president's term of office, or his tenure, is fixed and does not depend on legislative support. So in other words, even if a president such as the President of the United States ends up that having the support of both the House of Representatives in the US as well as the US Senate, he will continue to stay in office, mainly because the US Constitution guarantees him a fixed term. And the only way that the US President, for instance, can be removed from office will be if he's impeached by the House of Representatives and then convicted by the US Senate. But even then, there must be constitutional grounds for the President being impeached and being convicted. And the US Constitution defines those grounds as being based on treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And because the term of the US President and does not depend on the support of the US Congress, for example, then to a great extent you might say that under a presidential form of government, the government is more stable. Now, whether or not that's actually true in practice might actually be questionable, depending on what you mean by stability. In a parliamentary system of government, because the government of the day depends on the support of the parliament, once the government of the day loses the support of parliament, that government, through the prime minister, will have to resign.